Well, good afternoon to all of those who are attending this lecture. And then I'd like to introduce Dr. Eric Larson, who is a senior research engineer at Andlinger Center for Energy and the Environment at Princeton University. It's a great pleasure to have you here, Eric, and he's going to present a report that was prepared and that's part of a work that has been carried out at the lab at Princeton University and deals with a net zero America. And this report has now drawn a great interest considering all the new actions that the American government is taking towards rapid switch and in terms of the environment. And then I'd like to welcome you, Eric, and it's a great pleasure to have you here. And then it's part of our print collaboration, University of São Paulo and Princeton University, and also part of the activities of what we are organizing here at the Research Center for Gas Innovation, which is becoming from next month, Research Center for Greenhouse Gas Innovation. And then thank you very much, Eric, and the floor is yours. Thank you, Eric.
Thank you, Julio. It's a pleasure to be here. This technology lets us communicate in better ways, I think, in some ways. So that's a positive side of the pandemic. So maybe we can turn to my slides. Thank you. So this is a project that has taken 2 years, and we've had 18 researchers working on it. 10 of us are at Princeton, and others are at other organizations around the country. So it was a big effort, and the final report, or the report that we've put out, is almost 350 pages of data. So I'm going to condense the big I will obviously not be able to cover all the details. But I hope you will be able to go to the website and look at the full report yourself if you're interested. So the questions that we were interested in to begin with is what does the energy system look like for the United States to reach net zero emissions by 2050? So that means in 2050, we're emitting to the atmosphere no more greenhouse gas emissions than we are removing from the atmosphere. And how does that affect the way we supply and use energy? And then importantly, what are the implications for things that people care about: land use, jobs, health, various industries, and the economy as a whole? And so what we really wanted to do was, what does this transition to net zero really look like on the ground? And what I think sets our study apart from most other modeling studies that have been done is the very high level of geographic resolution that we modeled and did our analysis at. And I'll give you some examples of that. So it becomes much more clear to people to understand what it actually means to get to net zero emissions. So we developed multiple scenarios for getting to net zero emissions. So this graph shows the primary energy supply in 2020 on the left. And you can see in the United States, we're dominated by fossil fuels. And then the second bar is 2050 in a sort of a business as usual future. That is, if there are no policy measures to decarbonize, we would end up in at least with official government projections, with a primary energy mix that looks quite similar to what it is today. And then the 5 bars to the right represent different ways to get to net zero emissions that we have modeled. And we intentionally designed 5 quite different pathways to illustrate what the implications are for one pathway or another. And so we don't have a favorite pathway here. All 5 of these will reach the goal of net zero emissions by 2050, but some of them will have challenges that are different from challenges in another pathway. And the idea is to inform the conversation that has to go on in our country as to which is the best direction to go. So across these 5 scenarios, we have 3 dimensions that we've explored. So in the first 2, what's called E plus and E minus, we explored the rate of electrification that is pursued in vehicles and buildings in particular. So E plus is a high electrification rate. E minus is a less high electrification rate. And you can see that there's more oil and gas used in 2050 in the E minus case than in the E plus case, because we don't electrify vehicles and buildings as fully. And then if we go to the right, the far 2 right bars, the ones that are labeled RE minus and RE plus, these utilize the high electrification rate on the demand side, but then we limit the amount of solar and wind electricity generation in the RE minus case. And we limit the amount of solar and wind to the amount that we have built in the US historically in a year, the maximum amount we have built, which is about 35 gigawatts. And so we call that a renewable constrained scenario. And then the far right one is the RE plus. That's where we require the economy to reach 100% renewable by 2050. So no more fossil energy use in that scenario. We also don't allow nuclear in 2050. And we also don't allow carbon storage below ground in that scenario. So that, in some respects, that is the most constrained scenario. In the middle scenario, the one labeled B plus, you see that the green section of the bar is much larger than in the other scenarios. And that is the contribution from biomass energy. And in 4 of the 5 scenarios with the smaller green bars, we limited the amount of biomass that could be used for energy to the amount of biomass that's available without changing the way we use land today. So no new cropland that is not being used for energy already is allowed to be used for biomass energy in those 4 scenarios. In the B plus scenario, we adopt a much larger potential for biomass supply, which comes from the Department of Energy did a study called the billion-ton study and estimated if we wanted to go to the maximum amount of biomass, including converting some cropland to bioenergy, that was taken as the potential in the B plus case. So you see that, and then the other thing to notice here is that at the bottom, it indicates the amount of CO2 that is sequestered in 2050 across these 4 scenarios. And in the 5th scenario, we don't allow sequestration of CO2, but we do capture CO2 and use it primarily for making synthetic liquid fuels in 2050, because we no longer allow use of petroleum as a liquid fuel in 2050. So you can see it's quite a range of different scenarios that we've developed. I won't go into the details of the way we did the modeling, but this slide sort of summarizes it. And it's in summary, we have multiple models that we use at multiple scales, both on the energy demand side, which are the first 2 boxes from left to right. And then on the supply side is the 3rd box. And then importantly, the last box is what we call downscaling. And downscaling is where we take results that were generated at a high level for modeling, and we use various methods to describe quantitatively what those scenarios look like at a much smaller scale. So state and sub-state level geographic resolution. And I'll show you some examples of that. the one thing to point out here on the modeling, on the far left, you see that we use the same energy service demands for every one of these pathways. So we're not assuming that there's any change in the delivery of, for example, the passenger kilometers that are traveled, the amount of floor space for buildings that's heated, and so on. So we're meeting the same energy service demands across all of these scenarios. So an important finding is shown here, and I should mention that the modeling is done at the high level, is done to minimize the overall cost of the energy system, given the constraints that we've applied to it. So given that we need to get to zero carbon, to net zero carbon by 2050, and then other constraints in some cases, not allowing wind and solar to grow as fast, requiring no fossil fuels by 2050 in the RE plus case, and so on. All of that modeling is done to minimize the overall cost of the energy system. And what this graph shows is the annual cost, annual spending on energy across our scenarios as a fraction of projected GDP. And what you see is that the cost on this basis is actually lower than it has been historically, or comparable to what it is today. So in 2020 or thereabouts, we're spending about 5% of our annual energy spending is about 5% of GDP. In times of the oil price shocks and the global financial crisis, of course, the percentage is much higher. But you can see for all of our scenarios, they're in the range of 5 to 6% of GDP. 3 of the scenarios are very close to each other in terms of cost, and the 2 of them are a bit higher, but they're all within historical range. So the finding here is that the transition is affordable if we do it right, but there are big changes that are required to get there, and I'll show you some of those. So I'm going to talk. We found that there are 6 key pillars for decarbonization that are common across all of our 5 scenarios, and I've shown them here. The first 4 are within the energy and industrial system, which is where we've focused our modeling. The last 2, 5, and 6 are reductions in non-CO2 emissions like methane and nitrous oxides and fluorocarbons, and also enhancing land sinks. So forests, regrowth of forests, soil carbon uptake in agriculture, and so on. We've made assumptions about what would happen with those pillars, and then the energy and industrial system has to provide the remaining amount of carbon reductions to get to net zero. And so the 4 pillars within the energy and industrial system: first, energy and energy efficiency and electrification. And what these do is reduce the total amount of energy that we need through efficiency. Electrification shifts the use of energy from fuels to electricity, and electricity is generally easier to decarbonize than fuels. But we need clean electricity, so that's the second pillar, both wind and solar, as well as additional transmission that needs to be built in order to connect the wind and solar to places where the electricity is needed. And then firm power, which refers to technologies that can balance the variability of the wind and the solar generation. In third pillar is bioenergy and other zero carbon fuels and feedstocks, especially hydrogen. Those are critical even in the long term. We need some liquid fuels, some fuels for difficult to electrify sectors. And then the fourth pillar is CO2 capture, utilization, and storage. So all of these, all 6 of these play a role in all of our scenarios. So on the energy productivity and electrification here, this shows the E plus and E minus scenarios relative to the reference case. And what you see here is a very dramatic reduction over time in final energy use. And You also see in the E plus case, the electricity portion, which is the dark blue, grows considerably from today out to 2050. It also grows in the E minus case, but not as rapidly. And you see additionally that the use of hydrocarbons is greatly reduced relative to what it is in the business as usual case. So petroleum, natural gas, and so on are reduced dramatically by doing this electrification. And so the challenge is of decarbonizing the hydrocarbons is an easier one to meet. Still challenging, but easier because of what we've done with efficiency and electrification. So this is on the generation side now. That solar and wind become very important sources of electricity in all of our scenarios, and you can see that they range from a doubling of our electricity generation today to almost a quadrupling in the RE plus case on the far right. But wind and solar, even in the case where we constrain the growth of renewables, that is the RE minus case, you see that wind and solar are still by 2050 about 40% of electricity generation there. In the other cases, we're in the 80 to 90% of generation. In the RE plus, we have almost 100% solar and wind generation. And what's interesting, if you look just over the next decade, all of these scenarios have a similar growth in solar and wind generation, and it's a significant growth. So it's adding close to 600 gigawatts of new solar and wind capacity by 2030 in all of these cases, except for the RE minus, which adds less solar and wind there. And what you see in the RE minus case is that we increase nuclear power because we don't have as much solar and wind. So this is an example of what we call the downscaling analysis, that to try to visualize where all this solar and wind electricity is going to be generated. So this is our current mapping of current wind projects, and in blue, and then it's difficult to see the solar projects, but if you look closely in California, you'll see a lot of them there. And this is what, and then the gray lines represent transmission. So we have 150 gigawatts of wind installed today and about 70 gigawatts of solar installed today. And if we go to 2030, then this shows what our scenario for the E plus case involves, and transmission lines. Excuse me 1 second, I got dogs barking. Susan. Apologies for that. So what we've done is map using a least cost algorithm for siting of solar projects and wind projects together with transmission to carry the electricity to demand centers. And you can see it growing by 2030, and then by 2050, we have a very significant increase in wind and solar farms. You can see off the coast of New Jersey on the right, there's offshore wind up and down the Atlantic coast. And we have 1.5 terawatts of capacity installed by this point. So this starts to help one visualize what the future would look like if we were to follow this E plus scenario. In fact, the RE plus has nearly twice as much installed capacity. So you can imagine what that would look like. And we have maps of that also in our report. So we also need to continue to have firm resources to generate the electricity to balance the solar and wind. And in all of these scenarios, we keep about between 500 and 1,000 gigawatts of capacity. And these are roughly what we have today in the US in terms of firm capacity. So we're not changing the existing system. We're really expanding it with all of the wind and solar on top of it. And in the one RE minus case, you can see the orange is a large increase in nuclear by 2050. So jumping to the third pillar, which was bioenergy and hydrogen, we again did a detailed mapping of where all the biomass would be within the country. And the resources that we've used are forest residues and crop residues and wastes. And we've also allowed for the use of some corn growing land to be converted into perennial energy grasses. So in the US today, about 40% of the corn production is used to make ethanol. And in our scenarios, the demand for gasoline-like fuels goes away in large part because of the electrification of the light-duty vehicle fleet. So we can phase out ethanol production for other hydrocarbon production from bioenergy or hydrogen production. And we've translated the biomass supply, which is shown in the map to the left here, into where you would have bioconversion facilities. And you can see that here that this becomes a very big industry in the US, particularly in the middle part of the country and in the southeast part of the country. And the main product of bioenergy in the scenarios is hydrogen. And hydrogen is quite valuable because it's a fuel, for one, and without carbon content. And when you capture CO2 during the conversion of biomass to hydrogen and store that CO2 below ground, you get negative emissions, which allow you to offset emissions coming from sources that are difficult to decarbonize completely. For example, jet fuel use in airplanes becomes difficult to decarbonize. And then jumping to the fourth pillar, CO2 capture and utilization. This graph shows you for the 5 scenarios on the upper panel where CO2 is being captured throughout by different technologies. And you can see green there is biomass conversion to hydrogen is in most of the scenarios is is not only a source of hydrogen, but also a source of CO2. You see also some natural gas reforming to make hydrogen in the RE minus case, that's the pink. And then the 2 places where you see the dark purple are direct air capture. So that is taking CO2 directly out of the air, and that becomes important in the E minus scenario because we are using more fossil fuel in that scenario by 2050, and we need to offset those emissions, and we do that by direct air capture and then storage of the CO2 below ground. And in the lower panel, what you see is how the CO2 gets used. The gray represents storage, and the red represents conversion to synthetic fuels. And just to give some sense of the scale here, in the E plus case, it's about a gigaton per year in 2050 of CO2 being stored below ground, and that's comparable to the on a volumetric basis to the scale of the petroleum industry, 30% bigger than the petroleum industry in the US today. So the CO2 transport and storage industry becomes very significant in 4 of our 5 scenarios. In the 5th scenario, you see that CO2 is captured, but it's not stored. It's used to make synthetic fuels to replace petroleum-derived fuels. And we've done some detailed layouts of the pipeline system that would need to be built to meet the demands for CO2 transport and storage. This map shows the current 2020 locations of CO2 pipelines in the US, of which there are considerable 8,500 kilometers of pipelines today, taking CO2 from natural formations and using piping it to locations such as West Texas, Permian Basin for enhanced oil recovery use. The gray areas here represent what appear to be the best formations below ground for storage of CO2. So this is 2020. By 2030, we envision an interstate CO2 trunk line system that would be built out in advance of a lot of CO2 capture happening. So the circles, the small colored circles, represent CO2 capture points, either from biomass conversion or from cement plants or from some natural gas power plants with CO2 capture. And the importance of building the trunk line system before we're doing a lot of capture is so that we can signal to the investors who are investing in CO2 capture plants that they will have a way to dispose of the CO2 that they've captured. They'll be able to put it into the pipeline and have it be taken for storage. So by 2050, then we've built out all of the capture facilities, and there's over 1,000 of these that would be capturing CO2, putting it into the pipelines. And you can see that in the thickness of the trunk lines represents the volume of CO2 that would be flowing. And most of the storage capacity, the best storage capacity, is in the Texas, Louisiana, Gulf Coast region. So roughly 3/4 of the CO2 is stored in that part of the country. The other interesting thing that you'll see here is that we have two different pipeline networks, one to the west of the Rocky Mountains and one to the east of the Rocky Mountains. So that's a very quick overview of four of our pillars of decarbonization. This is a graph that's designed to illustrate that there's no one of these scenarios that's going to be easier in all dimensions than others. So there are different challenges to executing this transition, whether it's electrifying vehicles, whether we can do that rapidly or not, how much wind and solar capacity we need to build. You can see the RE plus, the blue one, is the most challenging there. The red one, which is RE minus, is the least challenging on that particular issue. But at the same time, if you look at nuclear generation, the RE minus, the red one, is the most challenging, and the RE plus, which is the blue one, is the least challenging. So there are different dimensions to this, including the amount of transmission lines that need to be built, the amount of labor that needs to be mobilized, the amount of capital that needs to be mobilized, and so on. And we've quantified all of these factors for each of the scenarios. And this graph just represents an ordinal ranking without assigning specific numbers, but it gives a sense of the trade-offs that would be involved in pursuing one or another of these scenarios. We've also looked at what the impacts would be on employment and air pollution. And so we've built a model that takes the results of the energy system analysis and translates those into the labor requirements. And we break down the jobs by economic sector, for example, manufacturing jobs versus construction jobs. We look at the jobs in different industries, so biomass industries versus solar industries versus wind industries, and so on. And what we found across the board is that we, in aggregate for the country as a whole, just in the first decade of this transition, we gain something between 500,000 and 1 million energy-related jobs relative to the business as usual scenario. And then jobs continue to grow over time after that. And if you look state by state, most states see job growth. That's the green represents growth over the decade. The yellow represents more or less a constant level, and red represents a decline in that decade. And you can see that there's mostly green on this map, but there are some places, West Virginia in particular, in the first decade when coal plants are basically shut down, West Virginia will suffer job losses unless some policies are put in place to help deal with that kind of situation. So that's the employment results, some employment results. And then we've also modeled air quality impacts and resulting health impacts, both from power plants, and this is showing the coal-fired power plants, the premature mortalities at a county level in the US due to emissions from coal plants. And then on the lower part is from motor vehicle pollution. And across all 5 of our scenarios, essentially by 2050, we've cleaned, essentially eliminated these premature mortalities because of electrification of vehicles and because of shutting down of coal-fired power plants. And so overall, across the whole transition, we avoid 200 to 300,000 premature deaths. There are many other health impacts that we have not estimated. There was a recent study that came out by some people at Harvard who had some very staggeringly high numbers for what the health impacts of air pollution are. But in our case, we've kept it only to looking at premature mortalities. So these are some of the co-benefits, employment and air pollution health impacts of a transition to net zero. And finally, we don't make any policy recommendations in this study for what the government should do. What we've tried to do is just paint the picture of what needs to be done through policy in order to reach net zero. And this graph is what we call our policy to-do list. And this represents the amount of capital that needs to be mobilized in the next decade and deployed in various parts of the economy, whether it's building wind and solar electricity on the left, expanding the electricity transmission network at the center, electrifying buildings and vehicles to the right a bit, or industrial process improvements over time. And then we have a small box in the lower right called option creation. And this is investments in technologies that we understand how to engineer more or less today, but they're not ready for commercial deployment at scale. And we need to develop some demonstration projects to have these technologies ready to be deployed when we get to the 2030s and beyond. And all 5 of our scenarios, this to-do list is pretty similar across all 5 of them. So we can make these investments as a country and be confident that they will be contributing in the longer term to our decarbonization strategies. But it's a lot of capital. It's $2.5 trillion more than a business as usual amount of investment that has to be mobilized in the first decade. So that's pretty much completes our study. The one thing I will finish on is, while we did not propose any policies per se, there was a National Academy study that was just released a few days ago that drew heavily on our results to actually recommend policies that would be needed to achieve the goals that, or at least attempt to achieve the goals that we identified in our study. So we've had I think an important contribution to this National Academy's report. And then, as Giulio mentioned at the beginning, our report has been really well received around the US and elsewhere. There's been a lot of media coverage. We've been giving briefings to congressional committees and people in the Biden-Harris administration, and many different companies are interested. And we've also begun some discussions with colleagues at other universities, including with Giulio and others here in Sao Paulo, about a net zero X studies. The style and detail that we've developed in our study has really resonated with people to help clarify what it means to get to net zero. And by doing similar studies in other countries, I think we begin to learn what's really possible in working towards a net zero future for us. So with that, I'll close. You have my email address there if you have questions beyond the session today, and I thank you for listening. Julio, I can't hear you.
Sorry. Thank you very much, Eric, for your very comprehensive presentation, and I was really impressed. And well, now we are going to have some questions. There are some people who already asked some questions, and I will try to summarize, because some of the questions were very much related, and then I will summarize. And then one of the questions you answered along your presentation, but if you could say something else regarding your opinion of CCS plus bioenergy, well, what we called BECCS. If you could say regarding the American experience, and you know very well the Brazilian case, and if you could compare somehow the potential and your vision on the American view of BECCS and your opinion regarding that towards Brazil.
Yeah, so BECCS is in our scenarios is a really valuable technology because of the fact that by the time we are approaching net zero emissions, the extra ton of carbon that we can take out of the atmosphere and put into the ground below is very expensive to do that, and so there's a high value in being able to do that, and that's why our model likes to build BECCS in all of the scenarios. As far as I think the opportunity in Brazil is huge. I think with BECCS, given the bio industries that you already have, with the sugarcane ethanol program, for example, you have an opportunity for a very easy capture of CO2 from fermentation, and a somewhat more difficult capture from combustion of the biomass. But the value will be very high in the longer term of doing that. So I think it's worth developing that option. And that was one of the recommendations that we had in that last to-do list slide that I showed, is to develop the technologies that will be needed for BECCS in the US this decade so that we can use them going forward in the 2030s and 2040s.
Yeah, well, yes. And well, there is another question that's very much related to the one that you just answered, because from what I understood, and in all scenarios, CCS is somehow included, or if I'm, well,
CCS, yeah, CO2 capture is included in all scenarios.
Okay, CO2 capture, okay,
yeah,
but not the storage.
The one scenario we disallowed storage. We said we're not. There's going to be people who maybe don't want storage, so let's look at what happens if we exclude it. But we still need to capture the CO2 in order to make liquid fuels by synthesis of hydrogen and CO2.
Okay, with the excess of solar and wind, you would have the electrons enough
right.
to produce the synthetic fuel.
Right. If we allowed more biomass energy to be used, we could reduce that amount of capture that's required, because we could make liquid fuels from the biomass. But we were already using all of the biomass that we were allowing the model to use. So the only other option was to go to CO2 capture from either direct air capture or other sources.
Okay. Well, there is one question regarding pillar number 6. If you could, comment on the data that you, well, for pillar number 6,
Mm-hmm.
regarding the data
Yeah.
that
So
you employed.
pillar
Yep.
6 was the enhanced land sinks. So the projections for the U.S. are that the land sink right now, we are absorbing. There's a lot of uncertainty, but on the order of 700 million tons per year of CO2 equivalent is coming out of the atmosphere into the land base. So that's trees that are forests that are regrowing um, primarily, and that those forests are going to be maturing, and the growth will slow down. So the expectation is that the the land sink will decrease over time if we don't do anything actively to increase it. And so it's maybe projected to drop by half by 2050. But in our analysis, we worked with some experts from the U.S. Forest Service to understand what the potential is for enhancing the land sink through various forestry measures. And we have in our report more details on that. But through that process, we made an assumption about where we think the forest land sink would end up in 2050, and that helps to then define what the energy system has to provide in the way of carbon reductions. So I would recommend going to the full report on that one.
Okay. Well, there are a list of questions also regarding hydrogen. And hydrogen, well, mainly green hydrogen, and your view, if you could just say some words about the
Yeah,
hydrogen economy and green hydrogen.
yeah. So hydrogen in our model, we have three different ways to make hydrogen in the future. One is natural gas reforming with CO2 capture. That process gives us hydrogen, but it also results in some emissions of CO2 still, because we can't capture all of the CO2. We have the hydrogen production from biomass with CO2 capture, and then we have hydrogen by electrolysis, so water splitting using solar or wind. And so all three of those play an important role. And I don't know what, I think different people call green hydrogen and blue hydrogen and black hydrogen. I don't know what all the different colors are, but the hydrogen we've come to call the biomass hydrogen emerald hydrogen, because it's very valuable green hydrogen because of the negative emissions. Um, the option for natural gas, um, making hydrogen from natural gas still results in carbon emissions, and when you're trying to get to net zero, every emission of carbon is costly. Um, with electrolysis, you get hydrogen without carbon emissions, but you don't get negative emissions. So emerald hydrogen is the one that we think is is the most important.
Yeah, that's interesting. I will keep in mind the emerald hydrogen. That's a good term for. There is a very interesting question here. Is there any possible comparison on the cost you mentioned to deploy all those technologies with the cost of doing nothing?
So the costs of doing nothing would be, uh, I guess maybe the question is referring to climate impacts, the costs of climate impacts.
Yes, I
Um,
think so. And
we haven't made that assessment, but if you look at even just the health impacts, the costs of health impacts, which we have looked at, those are just the premature mortalities avoided is $2 to $3 trillion of cost avoided. So you can begin to get some sense of comparison when you look at those numbers, but we haven't tried to estimate the damage costs from climate change. That I think there's a lot more speculation in that, and uncertainty. So, but I would guess that the costs are much higher than what the cost of deploying all the technology is that we've estimated.
yeah, that's a good point because, well, if you just think about the health cost, is a huge number. And then you don't enter on those speculations regarding climate change, because then the method that you would employ to assess the costs of climate change is much more prone to criticism. But health, that's interesting. And the new number, it's the order of 2 trillion US dollars. It's a huge amount of money.
Mm-hmm.
And well, regarding there is another question regarding ethanol, because well, if you take the cost of burning, or not cost, if you consider the route of ethanol as a route using combustion and the current technology, and if you compare with producing hydrogen from ethanol, in your models, how you compare those two, the use of ethanol?
So in the way we included ethanol in the model was really only as a gasoline substitute.
Okay.
We didn't consider the route that you could take ethanol and make hydrogen from it, for example. We only considered it as a gasoline substitute, and when you do that, the model is electrifying most of the vehicle fleet that uses gasoline, and so gasoline demand goes away, which means ethanol demand goes away in our scenario. So that's I think I mentioned at the end that a net zero Brazil study would be really interesting contrast to what we've done in the U.S. Because of the different mix of resources that's available in Brazil and the different characteristics of the country. So I think that's an issue that one could explore much more deeply, and especially in the context of Brazil.
Yes, as we previously talked last week, I think that we set a group. We are starting now setting a group that will work on that, and that will be a point that we are going to discuss with you in the next meeting, because we are already gathering a group of people to work in a Brazilian-like report and to see the scenarios and to study in terms of scenarios. And as you said, there are some similarities in Brazil, but there are some difference, very big difference in terms of the use of nuclear power that for us is very low, and but regarding solar and wind energy, I think the potential for Brazil is very similar to the United States. Keeping in mind the, how can I say, the proportion, the difference of our economies, but in percentual terms, I think that's the wind and solar will be very similar. However, bioenergy is something that for us is different, and this group is going to work, and then together with you, I think that, and with your group, it's going to be a very good study that we intend to do in the next couple of years. Well, there is another question, very interesting question here, is very direct. And when is going to be in your models and in your opinion, when is going to be the peak of the use of oil?
Peak for the U.S. or peak globally?
For the U.S. For the U.S.
So I think we're already past it. I think we're in our scenarios. We're definitely past it. But oil demand has been, not leaving aside the COVID pandemic, oil demand has been slowly declining because of the fuel economy gains that are being made. And now with the new administration that's re-implementing the fuel economy standards, I think we're going to continue to see declines, and particularly if we're going for a net zero economy, which is the goal of the administration now. I don't think there's any direction that the oil can go besides down.
Yeah. And well, there is another question related. Well, this is one question that I'd like to do myself. Because if you think about new technologies regarding, well, it's related to BECS and the use of CO2 to not only to make synthetic fuels, but to be employed, for instance, related to soil capture of CO2. And then I can give you an example, a direct example that I think in one of our meetings we discussed. The development of hydrogels that we would produce that hydrogel from CO2 from BECS, and then employ that hydrogel to increase the rate of carbon sink, that carbon would be stored in the soil, and at the same time would improve the productivity or in terms of reforestation or even some particular kinds of crops like soya beans and so on. How do you see those new technologies that are coming out?
So I guess as you were describing that, the technology that came to my mind was biochar, which is
Yeah,
another way of basically taking biocarbon and putting it into the ground to improve soil productivity, but also store the carbon in the soil. Um, I think those are important. In our study, we did look at in agriculture what could be done to increase soil carbon absorption. We didn't assume any technologies like what you're describing, because we wanted to limit the options in the model to only things that we really understood commercially today, or with pretty good knowledge of the technologies and ability to scale them. So we limited the agricultural analysis to fairly conventional things like no till cultivation, and a few other sort of basic kinds of changes. And there, we make there's a potential for carbon storage, but it's not large compared to the scale of the problem that we're dealing with. It's something like a quarter billion tons, 0.25 gigatons per year, sort of maximum level of carbon storage, which is, again, it's helpful, but it's not going to solve the whole problem. I don't know if I answered the question.
yeah, okay. There is another question here. Commission these wind and solar physical structures onshore can be considered a problem for a country as USA?
Definitely. That's a good. That's the idea of presenting the maps that we showed you. There are already people who object to, for example, building wind turbines in places because of the way they look, or because they're concerned about other impacts. And our scenarios require a massive upscaling of that idea, and so there's going to be challenges to getting all of that capacity sited, which I think is what the question is referring to. And not only the capacity for wind and solar, but also the transmission lines that will need to be built to connect from the wind farms and the solar farms to the places where the electricity is needed, because most of the wind is going to be far from population centers. The solar can be sited a little more close to population centers, but generally wind farms are far away, so you need transmission systems to do that. And our analysis showed that we'd have to increase the transmission system by 60% by 2030, and then by tripling the size of the transmission system by 2050. So I think that's one of the biggest challenges of getting to net zero is what we call the social license. It's people accepting the impacts that go with it.
Yeah, this this it's a very important point for us also at RCGI now that we are starting a new phase. Social perception is going to be one of the points that we are going to have a group work on that. That's very interesting. And well, if you talk about solar, solar is much easier, as you said, and you don't have the problem with the transmission lines. But to triple the transmission lines in the US to reach that goal in a zero carbon economy in 2050 is really, well, it's
yeah, it is
a huge cost.
Well, yeah. Not and cost, I think, is not the biggest challenge. Not financial cost is not the challenge. It's the
social life.
Yeah.
Yeah, the social cost to allow them to do that. Yeah, that's a great point. And well, at last this is I think it's the final question that in terms of the time. And then the other ones I'm going to send you by email later on if you could answer. The last question is related to the public perception, and it's a very direct question. What are the main challenges related to the public perception in those scenarios that you presented?
Yeah, I think in terms of public perception, the most significant challenge is going to be the land use impacts, right? Because those are what people see, and there's objections to building pipelines, there's objections to building high voltage transmission lines, there's objections to building offshore wind farms or onshore wind farms, objections to CO2 storage. So there are parts of society that every single one of the pillars are going to be objected to in some fashion. So I think it's really about, well, if I had to pick a single most, I think as our scenarios start to be understood more widely by people, the recognition of what the impact that solar and wind, to do it at the scales that, it's very easy to say we want a lot of solar and a lot of wind, but to do it at the scales that are needed to get to net zero implies a big impact that I don't think people appreciate as much as is realistic. And so it may end up being that scenarios that that don't depend as much on solar and wind become more likely to happen because of that pushback that starts to come, for either pushback from public perception, or if it just becomes too challenging to get the supply chains together to build that rapidly. So the idea of our project was to put information out there that would enable different stakeholders in society to have conversations about this and decide collectively which way they want, which way society should go. We don't know what the answer is. We don't have the crystal ball to say what's the best way to go. It's going to be people ultimately talking and deciding.
Yeah, but that's the point that, well, your study, your report was an excellent, well, because I think all the visibility that your report achieved in the past, mainly in the past 2 or 3 months, and with the new government in the US, I think that it was very impressed, and I think that the case in Brazil, as we made some comments. Now we set the group, and for those who are interested in participating in the group, we have Professor Carlos Eduardo Serri, who is attending also here your talk. He is going to be responsible for land use and to have his group working on that. Professor Marcos Buquerich on BECS, and together with Suani Coelho, who you know very well, they are going to work on BECS, and Liane Rossi and Pedro Vidinha, who are part of our center, related to CCU technologies, and to see how we can include those technologies that I just mentioned. And regarding greenhouse gases, Professor Emílio Nelly Silva and Professor Carlos Ginter is going to work on that. And finally, everything related to public perception, we have a group together with standardization of new technologies. That is the issue, the legal terms, and we have a group that's led by Professor Edmilson Moutinho Santos, who is going also to work. And then we had our first meeting last week to start forming that group. And then, well, Eric, I think that the time now is, well, we even passed a bit, almost 10 minutes, the planned time. I'd like to thank you again for the opportunity that you gave to us and to the audience to present your report. And hopefully in the next couple of weeks and couple of months, we are going to have that group established. And then we are going to work together with you to try to have a report taking the Brazilian case, and is going to be a pleasure to work with you on that. Well, thank you very much.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Thank you. And
yeah. I was just going to say it'd be fabulous to see a Brazil study, with a similar level of detail and analysis, because I think it can really help move conversations forward. So I look forward to being part of that.
Okay, thank you, and thank you for all the people who are attending this talk. And I think there are people from Brazil, from different sides of Brazil, from Shell. I can see people from Shell Brazil, and from some other people who I don't know, but it was a great presentation. And now it's time for us to read in detail the 300, almost 400 pages report. And well, but thank you very much, Eric, and hope to see you soon through, how can I say, through these new technologies, and personally, probably by the end of the year, or hopefully by the end of the year. Thank you very much, Eric.
Okay.
And then, and thanks to everybody. And well, now I'm going to close the section. Bye-bye, and have a good afternoon in Brazil, good evening in Europe for those who are attending from Europe, and from those in the United States. And I think that's still morning there. Most of the states is still morning. Thank you. Bye-bye, Eric. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.